1, 2, 3, and bang! You there, right there behind the screen, have been rapidly transported into the Elder Scrolls universe, a soul destined to be thrust into the world of Tamriel as one of the 10 playable races of the Elder Scrolls game series. But the big question on the tip of everyone's tongue is, which race would you be? Which race is worth it? Is it worthwhile being an Argonian? Is it worthwhile being an Orc? These are the questions that we endeavor to answer in this series of videos. What is up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Scott from FudgeMuppet, and today I am back to bring you a brand new episode of this Is It Worth It series. In the description below are all the previous episodes, and I will add in the future episodes as they are made. Now, of course, this kind of video has a lot of variables, including personal preference, but we will do our best to analyze each of the races and determine whether or not if they are worth being. So, today, let's look at the pros and cons, the benefits and detriments of being a high elf. Is being a high elf worth it? So before we dive into the topic itself, let's just set some things straight. In the previous videos in the series, we explained the parameters, but just to recap, we are making two assumptions to add some consistency to the evaluation. One, we are assuming that each race is born in their homeland, i.e. an Argonian in Blackmarsh or Redguard in Hammerfell, and two, we are talking about a contemporary context, meaning the time of Skyrim, which is the 201st year of the 4th era. But yes, that's all we need to know. Time to get down to the nitty-gritty. So for this video, if we were a soul in the Elder Scrolls universe that could choose to be any of the playable races, would being a high elf be worth it? Let's begin. Of all the elves to migrate to Tamriel from the distant land of Aldmeris, it is believed that the High Elves are the most direct, unaltered descendants of the early Oldmer. This much is evident from the name alone, which I'll address now to avoid a great deal of confusion. The early elven settlers of Tamriel are called the Oldmer with a D, while the High Elves of Somerset are called the Altmer with a T. The Oldmer, meaning early folk or elder folk, had little trouble settling on Tamriel and displacing the native beast races, for they were significantly more technologically advanced than the ancestors of the Khajiit and the Argonians, among others. During the Merethic era, all facts need to be taken with a little grain of salt, and this rule even applies to the mysterious continent of Aldmeris, which many scholars believe never even existed. But that question is not one for today. What is important to note is that the early Oldmer were initially concentrated in the Somerset Isles. The many varieties of elves we see in modern times exist due to further migrations to the mainland of Tamriel. The Durrani elves of the Iliac Bay maintained much of their Oldmer heritage, but the Aelids, the Bosmer, the Orcs, the Marimir, the Khymer, these races deviated drastically from their ancestry. When the various subsets of elves set sail for mainland Tamriel, a significant chunk of Oldmer chose to stay isolated in Alinor, which is the name the Aldmeri Dominion today gives the Somerset Isles. Unsurprisingly, these elves were not subjected to the same environmental or magical factors that altered the biology of the other elven races, and these Ultima elves maintained almost all of their ancestral traits and features. This purity is something the High Elves take great pride in, and it has a clear impact on every other aspect of Ultima life, as we'll see throughout the video. The Ultima call themselves the Cultured People, and that should immediately tell you how the High Elves perceive themselves. If you choose to be born a High Elf, well, you'll receive a great deal of respect from your peers simply for your blood alone. They are on average the tallest of the Tamrielic races, their skin is golden in tone, they are innately gifted in the arts of magic, possessing greater magical reserves than all others, they are resistant to most diseases, and they have incredibly long lifespans. Some have been known to live for thousands of years, and they are among the most intelligent of known races. On top of all that, the amount of time the races spent in a cohesive society in a racially and socially homogeneous region has given them a significant advantage in establishing a robust civilization, free from much of the turmoil which frequently undermines the mainland races. We'll touch on all these aspects in a little bit more detail, but when summarized like that, it's nearly impossible to find a downside to being a High Elf. Granted, mainlanders associate the name High Elf with being proud and snobbish, and these lesser races are quick to envy and resent the Ultima for it, but that's a pretty reasonable drawback considering all the positives. Fortunately, as a High Elf, your ego will almost certainly be large enough to drown out the haters, and you can flex on those mainland manlets from the comfort of your glass towers across the sea in Somerset. Speaking of Somerset, what would it mean to be born in the Somerset Isles? Well, if you were a member of another race, it wouldn't be ideal. Historically, policy makers in Alinor have been at odds with determining whether to allow foreigners on their lands at all. In the Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition, we hear descriptions of Somerset's capital city, Alinor, from a distance. Human traders were only allowed in the ports at this time in the late First Era. They describe the city as made from glass or insect wings. Less fantastic accounts come from the imperial emissaries of the Riemann dynasty, which describe the city as straight and glimmering, a hypnotic swirl of ramparts and impossibly high towers designed to catch the light of the sun and break it to its component colors, which lies draped across its stones until you are thankful for nightfall. One of these emissaries in service to Riemann Cyrodiil II in the late First Era documents his attempts to engage in diplomacy with the High Elves and their Aldmeri dominion. He states the following in his journals as documented in the Pocket Guide. The Ultima despise other elves as unsophisticated curls and barely consider the non-Aldmeri races at all. They pay their imperial tithes, I'm sure, not for fear of war with the humans, but rather to keep an invasion from infecting their islands. This emissary, Eric of Gis, spent much time among the High Elves, and the Pocket Guide vouches for the reliability of his accounts. These accounts are scathing, and you can sense the hatred in his writings, so it is likely there's a significant amount of embellishment in here, but regardless, from him we learn a lot about High Elf society. He says, High Elves consider themselves to be the only perfect race. Over hundreds of generations, they have bred themselves into a racially pure line, and are now almost identical to one another in appearance. The theory that the High Elves do not reproduce as quickly or as often as humans is false. Rather, and to my horror, they kill 9 out of 10 babies born to them in their obsession for purity. Breeding outside the pure line is a terrible, unthinkable crime, and taken as prima facie evidence of the tainted blood of the individual in question. If they were, they wouldn't have the impulse to do it. Exile to the mainland is regarded as equivalent to a death sentence, since there is no purpose in living outside their ideal society. They have a high regard for order and gravitate naturally towards wearing uniforms and speaking in formal patterns. They feel no real tenderness for one another and have no concept of compassion. They are decadent and self-obsessed. They surround themselves with riches and treasures, the works of great artists and the finest of everything, but have no real appreciation for any of these things. Each of them is concerned solely with himself, and as a result they do no real socializing. They meet and hold courts only to demonstrate their importance and power to each other. The Pocket Guide assures us of Eric's reliability, so should we take this detailed account as completely accurate, or is Eric the human exhibiting some kind of envy and resentment that we spoke about earlier? If his words are true, then that could be a strong argument against being a high elf. What if you were one of the 90% of babies killed for not being pure enough? And if you survived that hurdle, would the ultimate dogma obsessed with purity and narcissism appeal to you? I believe that this Eric's statements are over-the-top caricatures of the High Elves, but as always, there is some root of truth to the stereotype. While 90% of babies may not be killed, the practice of eugenics and selective breeding is definitely there amongst the High Elves, and the societal structure of purity, bloodlines, formality, and duty over enjoyment seems to be the status quo. If we look at the 3rd edition of the Pocket Guide to the Empire, we can see some documented evidence of Somerset's improved racial tolerance in recent centuries. As Somerset has been exposed to the rest of Tamriel, so too has their national sentiment changed. The guide says, with the insularity of the Somerset decisively broken, many Ultima, particularly the young, which among the High Elves is a fairly loose term, began to take a more critical view of the rigid hierarchy of Ultima society and its strict cultural xenophobia. While there had always been discontent on the fringes of Ultima society, which was traditionally resolved by exile of the malcontents, for the first time a significant element of Ultima began to agitate for social change. This nascent revolution in the Somerset Isle has taken many forms. Most constructive, surely, is the acceptance of new cultures and races onto its shores, some occupying positions that would have been forbidden just a century ago. The Queen of Firsthold, for example, is the Dunmer Morgaya, daughter of Baron Zaya and sister of the King of Morrowind, Helseth. Her children Goranthia and Renala, although half Ultima, are fully Dunmer in appearance and stand to inherit the throne. But even with these gradual developments, racial discrimination will never be removed from Ultima lands or Ultima hearts completely. It is far too ingrained, and with the rise of the nationalist, supremacist Thalmor in the 4th Era, it remains a contemporary issue. Being born in the Somerset Isles as a high elf, however, that is a much more desirable way to begin mortal life, assuming you are pure enough to survive the supposed 90% infant mortality rate. The first benefit of being a high elf born in Somerset is Somerset itself. Many travellers credit the Isles as being the most beautiful region in all of Tamriel. As the guide to the Blessed Isles states, though we may pine for old Elnefay, the golden warmth of the divines will always dry our tears in the sun-kissed land of Somerset. And the land of the Ultima is often called the birthplace of both civilization and of magic. This means being native to the Isles grants you some exclusive opportunities, and if you wish to become a powerful magic user, there is no better place to be born. And what if you wish to expand your horizons, venturing to the mainland? Well, as a high elf, you have some privilege in this regard. If you're a foreigner wishing to visit the Isles, you know already from what we've covered that the odds are stacked against you, but as a high elf visiting the other provinces, you can expect to move relatively freely without trouble. Of course, some regions like Blackmarsh are naturally inhospitable to non-natives, but other than that, the only real complications come from the turbulent political climate in Tamriel. We discussed the political shifts taking place within Somerset already, but the work of the Dominion and the Thalmor has increased racial tensions in many of the provinces. In Hammerfell, for instance, wounds are still fresh from the conflicts between the Dominion and the Redguards. The Redguards did not wish to hand a large chunk of their land over to the High Elves, and after a decade of war, the Second Treaty of Strathmakai was signed. I imagine Hammerfell is not the friendliest of places for a High Elf. Similarly, in Skyrim, where civil war has torn the province in two, many of the Nordic natives resent the Ultima for outlawing Talos worship. High Elves are of course tolerated, more so in the western half of the region, but you can expect to attract plenty of scowls and snide remarks. In the grand scheme of things though, this is a far better treatment than most travelling races can expect. But when asking the question, is being a High Elf worth it, knowing what we know, the positives dwarf the negatives. Yes, your culture is elitist. Yes, the other races consider you to be pretentious, but even Pellinor Whitestrake, the Elf Slayer himself, would be lying if he said the egos of the High Elves were not somewhat justified. Your race is the tallest, the most intelligent, the most magically gifted. Your homeland is rich with history, beauty, and legacy, as well as academic and arcane opportunity. And when men grow old and die at 80, you still have centuries of life to gain experiences, to further your studies and skills, to achieve greatness. So for me, the answer is definitely yes. So would you consider being a High Elf worth it? Your reputation for a heightened ego precedes you wherever you go, but chances are your superiority complex is backed by your undeniable superiority. That seems like a pretty good trade-off to me, but what do you guys think? Is being a High Elf worth it for you? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and let me know what race you would like to see discussed next. Thanks so much for watching this video. Head down into the description below for social media links, of which you can follow, as well as the previous installments of this Is It Worth It series. My name is Scott from FudgeMuppet. Thanks so much again for watching, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.